Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll start in just a minute or two. We'll give people a little bit of grace time to sign on. All right, everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. So first of all, I want to say thank you very much for joining us for our first webinar in our NC CASC webinar series. Oh, I guess I'll turn myself on so you can actually see me. My name is Heather Yoakum. I am the Stakeholder Engagement Lead for the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, and we're very excited to have you here today. Like I said, this is our first webinar in our series. And the purpose of this series is really to just highlight some of the ongoing research that's happening in our North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center network, and feature topics that are pretty important to natural resource managers and other stakeholders in our region. For those of you who don't know, the NC CASC region includes Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. And we're really trying to connect researchers and managers and practitioners to the science that they might need, to success stories and actual case studies of how we've actually used science successfully, and solutions for natural and cultural resource management and adaptation under a changing climate. So that's what our series will be about. There we go. So just a couple of logistics before we get started. We are recording this webinar, so it will be available online for folks who can't make it live. We will be muting everyone and turning off your video while the presentation is going, but we will be monitoring the chat box. So if you have questions that come up during the presentation, please go ahead, put them in that chat box. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll sort of group those questions together and present them to Kim and also to Phil and to Mike, who will be joining us as well. They can answer those, and then we'll let everyone unmute and turn off their videos or turn on their videos if they'd like, for kind of an open Q&A session at the end of the hour. So the presentation will take about 40-ish minutes, so we should have enough time for plenty of discussion afterward. And so I'll take a quick minute to just introduce our wonderful presenters. Today they'll be talking about post-fire conifer regeneration under a changing climate. Dr. Kimberley Davis is a research scientist at the University of Montana. Dr. Davis works on post-fire conifer regeneration through ongoing and new projects funded by us, the North Central CASC, and some others. She earned her PhD in ecology and environmental science from Montana State University in the spring of 2016. And her dissertation focused on understanding the drivers and feedbacks of lodgepole pine invasion in New Zealand and Patagonia. And that was part of an NSF-funded wildfire project. And as a postdoc, Dr. Davis has led work investigating post-fire tree regeneration of ponderosa pine and Douglas-fir in low elevation forests in the Western US. And this work is jointly funded by NSF and the Joint Fire Science Program. We're also joined by Dr. Phil Higuera, who is an associate professor of fire ecology, in the Department of Ecosystem and Conservation Sciences at the University of Montana. And he directs the paleoecology and the fire ecology lab there. So I will leave those intros there. And Kim, if you'd like, you can take it away.
Sure. Will you just put your video back on for 1 second, Heather? Sorry, it won't let me put my video on unless you're up there. Okay, now, because that bar disappeared, but we're good now. Thank you. Okay, so as Heather said, I'm going to be talking about some work that I've done as part of my postdoc with Phil Higuera and also Solomon Dabrowski at the University of Montana. And I'm going to largely, sorry, the screen is on the wrong. I'm just going to switch screens real quick. Okay. I have many collaborators in this work, and so I just like to thank all of my collaborators, especially Zach Holden, who's done a lot of work on the reforestation tool that I'm going to be talking about, and also Mike Schaedel from the Nature Conservancy, who's actually here with us, and we'll talk a little bit at the end of the talk about how he's been using some of the work that we've been doing to do some management in an area that burned recently that the Nature Conservancy owns. So increasingly across the Western US, we're starting to see areas like this following wildfire where we're not seeing a lot of conifer regeneration. And this has been observed across a wide variety of states and different ecosystem types, but especially in the lower elevation ponderosa pine and Douglas-fir forest, we're starting to see this. This is an example of a fire that was near Helena, Montana in 2000, and this is 17 years following the fire, and you can see there's really not a lot of tree regeneration occurring. And so there's a few reasons why this might be happening, but one of the reasons that we're interested in exploring is to what extent are these regeneration failures due to climate change. And so the reason why climate might be so important for these changes that we're seeing following fire is because like many organisms or most organisms, trees are controlled, their distribution is controlled by climate. And so for example, we might have a species that can exist in a certain range of precipitation and temperature, as shown here on this figure. But what we know is that tree seedlings actually have a smaller climate niche than adults. And this is because these seedlings are really small, their roots are really short, and so they don't get down into deeper soil water. So they're really sensitive to drought stress. And also these really tiny seedlings don't have bark yet, and so they can be girdled by really high surface temperatures, which is especially a problem if you have black soil following a fire. So really high surface temperatures and drought are important stressors for these seedlings. And so what can happen, because trees are so long-lived, is that we can have areas where it's too warm and too dry for regeneration currently, but a couple hundred years ago when trees established, the climate conditions were suitable for regeneration. But because the adults can persist where it's warmer and drier, we currently have forests, even though we're not seeing any regeneration there. And so when you have an area that's out here where we might have conditions that are too warm or too dry for regeneration, if we have a stand replacing disturbance like a high severity wildfire, then we might expect to see a vegetation transition to some type of non-forest state or to a different forest type that's more adapted to hot temperatures and dry conditions. And so what our work really focused on was trying to figure out how does annual climate affect post-fire recruitment? So what climate conditions define this blue circle? Next, we were interested in trying to figure out how climate suitability has changed over time. Is climate change already affecting whether or not we're seeing post-fire regeneration? And then recently, we've been working to try to use this understanding to help inform management decisions. And that part's really new, but we'll get to that. And so the way that we wanted to go about this was to go to a bunch of fires, sample a bunch of trees, and age them and figure out what were the climate conditions like when these trees established to be able to better understand what kind of conditions are necessary to see tree establishment. And so we had 90 sites across 4 main regions in the Western US. So the Northern Rockies, Colorado, the Southwest, and California. We sampled only ponderosa pine and Douglas-fir, and we specifically targeted sites that were on the warmer and drier end of the distributions of these species within each region. because that's where we expected the climate signal to be the strongest. At each one of these sites, we lay out transects and we destructively sampled all of the seedlings that had, or juvenile, so up to about 25-year-old trees that had established following fire. We did this destructive sampling because we wanted to get annual precision to the exact year that the trees started growing or established. And there's several ways to kind of count bud scars or count tree whorls when you're in the field to estimate age, but you can't get annual precision. So to get true annual precision, what we had to do was dig up the trees or the seedlings, cut segments across the root shoot boundary, then we sanded those down and we aged all of the segments under the microscope. And that way we could be sure that we got the oldest age of that seedling and we knew exactly which year it established. So we did this for almost 3,000 trees, which as you can imagine was really, took a lot of time, but it was really worth it because we ended up with this great data set. And for each one of our sites, we had an age structure. So what that is this is an example of an age structure here where we have the ponderosa pine recruitment on the Y. So basically the percent of the trees that established at the site that established in each one of these years. This site had a fire and where this red year is. And what you can see is that the year after the fire, there wasn't any regeneration, which is, contrary to what we often expect. And we see a lot of variability in when we saw establishment. So 2009, we saw a big pulse of establishment. So we want to try and figure out what's driving this variability. To do this, we used boosted regression tree models to model whether or not there's establishment in each year at all of our sites based on 9 non-climatic predictors and also climatic predictors. And so we included non-climate predictors that we know from other work are really important for post-fire regeneration, such as time since fire, distance to seed source, and also fire severity. For climate predictors, we had mean summer vapor pressure deficit, which is basically a measure of how dry the air is and how much the air is kind of pulling water out of these seedlings. We also had 3 variables that were from an eco-hydrologic model. We worked with hydrologists who provided this data with it for us. And so that was maximum skin temperature or surface temperature, so the temperature right at the ground level, spring soil moisture, and soil moisture of the driest month. What we found was that there are strong threshold relationships with climate, between recruitment and climate. And so what I'm showing here are the plots with recruitment probability on the y-axis and the climate variables on the x-axis. And what you'll notice is that once a specific threshold is crossed, there's a big decline in recruitment probability, both for summer VPD and then the opposite, a big increase in recruitment probability with an increase in soil moisture of the driest month. So for ponderosa pine, these are the 2 most important variables. For Douglas-fir, we saw a similar but somewhat less defined thresholds for maximum surface temperature and also spring soil moisture. So maximum surface temperature, there's still a really strong threshold, and that's, we think, related to what I mentioned, how seedlings get girdled from those really hot surface temperatures. And then, of course, spring soil moisture is important when seedlings are trying to get established and their roots are really short. So once we had developed these relationships between climate and recruitment, we were interested in figuring out how has climate suitability changed over time. And so the first way that we were able to do this was just to look at the climate time series of our sites and compare them to the thresholds that we had identified. So here I'm just showing an example of summer vapor pressure deficit for ponderosa pine. Again, here's the threshold, and over on the right we see this dashed line represents that threshold of -1, and each of the colored lines represents the time series for one of our regions. So it's the mean of all those sites that were in each region. Every time one of the lines goes below the threshold, that means it's a suitable year in terms of VPD for regeneration. And so every time a line went below that dashed line, I put a dot at the bottom. And so those dots represent years that would be good for recruitment. What you notice is that before 2000, there are a lot of dots. After 2000, we don't see too many dots. So this really suggests that climate change could be one of the factors that's driving this decline that we're seeing in recruitment following fire. But this is just an example of one variable. And as you saw, we had 2 climate variables for each species in each model. And so we wanted to combine those And using our models, while holding distance to seed source, fire severity, and time since fire constant, we predicted from 1980 to 2015 recruitment probability at each one of our sites using the actual time series of climate from each site. So again, here the lines represent the mean of all the sites from each region. And basically this is a measure of climate suitability over time for recruitment. And so what you'll notice first is that it's really episodic. So there's a lot of peaks. And this is what we might expect since we chose on purpose the hottest and driest sites. So not every year is suitable for recruitment, but prior to 2000, again, we see that there's still a lot of peaks. So there's still a lot of opportunities for ponderosa pine to have a good recruitment year. After 2000, in every region except for in the Colorado Front Range, we see a significant decline in the size and number of peaks, suggesting that climate is driving these declines that we're seeing in recruitment. For Douglas-fir, we saw more variable patterns, and this has to do with the fact that spring soil moisture, which was an important driver of Douglas-fir regeneration, has had less of a trend over time than other climate variables like VPD. VPD has consistently gone up, whereas spring soil moisture doesn't really have a linear trend over this time period. But we do see that in the Northern Rockies, because the surface temperatures have gone up so much, we see a significant decline in recruitment probability for Douglas-fir. There wasn't a trend in California, and in the Southwest, it's statistically significant, but as you can see, it's not a really strong trend downwards. So these are the trends and the patterns that we've seen just at our sites, which again were the hottest and driest sites that we could find recruitment at. And so we are also interested in how widespread is this pattern, and do we see this in a lot of areas, or might this only be a problem in the very hottest and driest sites? And so, as I mentioned, the climate data that we used for these models came from a really computationally intensive eco-hydrologic model. So we couldn't use those exact variables to predict spatially. So what we did instead was use 4-kilometer terra climate data. I rebuilt the boosted regression tree models using that data, and then I was able to predict across the range of ponderosa pine within the intermountain ecoregions the expected recruitment probability in various decades to look at how it's changed over time. So what you're seeing here are graphs showing the proportion of the first 5 years following each fire that are suitable for regeneration. So basically, we know that a lot of recruitment happens in the first 5 years. It doesn't all happen just in the first year. So for example, for our data, 70% of recruitment happened in the first 5 years. So we wanted to see if we included that in our annual variability, what was the effect instead of just looking at 1 year. So basically, on these top row of maps, if it's red, it means that 0 or 1 of the first 5 years following fire were suitable for recruitment. If it's dark blue, it means that all of those first 5 years following the fire were suitable for recruitment. And this is while holding fire severity constant as well as distance to sea source at 50 meters. So a couple important patterns emerge. First, you really see a strong latitudinal trend where, as you might expect, in the Southwest, we see a lot of red. So the climate in the Southwest, even in the 1980s and the 2000s, is not very suitable for recruitment everywhere. And so this agrees with a lot of work that's been done down there to age establishment pulses, and they've seen that establishment of ponderosa pine is really episodic and depends on really specific climate conditions or really wet years. And so this agrees with that. This might also be a reflection of the scale of the climate data. So of course, at 4-kilometer scale resolution, you're not going to pick up microclimate differences due to topography or canopy cover. And so within some of those red areas, there's definitely areas that might have microclimate that is suitable for regeneration. Another pattern that's important to note is that as you would expect, as it gets warmer and drier in the future, we see a big decline in recruitment probability, even in the Northern Rockies. And so this is a future climate scenario that's an increase in the global mean temperature of 2 degrees Celsius relative to a pre-industrial baseline. So we expect this to happen in about the mid-century period. And then you can see the two maps at the bottom are the differences between the decades. So there's been a lot of change already since the 1980s to the first decade of the 2000s, and then we expect to see even more change into the future. So we also did this for Douglas-fir. And what you'll notice for Douglas-fir is that similarly to ponderosa pine, there's the latitudinal trend where in the Southwest, we don't see a lot of area that's really good for Douglas-fir recruitment. But what you also notice is that there's a lot of area in the Northern Rockies and the Central Rockies where there's a lot of blue on that map. And so that's partially because Douglas-fir, the distribution of Douglas-fir extends into wetter and cooler areas than ponderosa pine. So a lot of the really dark blue areas on that map don't actually have a lot of ponderosa. Also, what's really interesting is you see that there really hasn't been very much change between the 1980s and the 2000s, contrary to ponderosa, but we do expect to see a lot of change between now and about mid-century, and especially in the Northern Rockies and some of the higher elevation or lower elevation areas in Colorado. So that's kind of the science background of what we've been working on. And now that we're understanding the relationship between climate and recruitment and kind of spatial patterns of that at the large scale, we wanted to figure out how can this understanding help inform management decisions at a smaller scale. So a map at this scale is not really useful for a manager, but we wanted to see what we could do that might help make management decisions easier following fires, specifically related to planting trees. So I'm just going to introduce this framework that I've been using to think about management decisions following fire. That's based on some work that Phil's done, also with Dave McWethy and a whole group of others, identifying different types of resilience to wildfire with changing wildfire conditions and changing climate. And so first, a lot of previous work has shown that available seed or distance to seed source is a very important driver of whether or not we see post-fire regeneration. And then the work that I've been presenting is trying to define this blue circle of where is climate suitable for regeneration. And so where suitable climate overlaps with available seed, that's where we expect to see natural seedlings. And so in those areas, we might be able to manage for basic resilience. And so this is what we traditionally think of as resilience, the ability of an ecosystem to recover similar structure and function following a disturbance. And so these areas we might expect to regenerate on their own. However, there might be areas that have suitable climate, but they don't have available seed. So maybe the center of large high severity patches, for example. In these areas, we have some opportunities to think about adaptive resilience or implementing management techniques that might help improve climate adaptation and also adaptation to a future with more frequent fires. And so some examples of things that we could consider in these areas are when we're planting our trees, if the management goal is to have forests on this landscape, instead of using densities that we might have planted at a few decades ago, it's important to maybe think about planting at lower densities or think about the spatial arrangement of the planting, because we do expect that these areas will burn again sooner than they would have in the past. And so if we have a really dense plantation, it's more likely to burn again at high severity. And so there's been a great review paper by Malcolm North and a whole bunch of other people talking about the best way to reforest for resilience, really thinking about how we can make these new plantations more resilient to fire because they're likely to burn. And then there's also the potential to think about expanding the climate niche of these planted seedlings, either through assisted gene flow, so taking genotypes from a lower elevation that might be more adapted to the future hotter and drier conditions and trying to move them uphill. Or also there's been some interesting new work on drought conditioning seedlings in the nursery before you outplant them that really helps increase survival on these kind of marginal sites. So there's a lot of interesting work going on in terms of management strategies that can be employed to help adaptive resilience. And then in areas where we maybe still have some available seed, but the climate isn't suitable, or areas where we don't have any seed and the climate's not suitable, those are the areas where we might think more about transformative resilience or accepting transitions to different types of vegetation type, maybe trying to direct those transitions to something that fit better with the management goals. So where we think that the current work that we've been doing can really fit into this and how that might be helpful for managers on the ground is that our work helps us identify where we might expect there to be basic resilience and where we might expect there to be suitable climate for planting trees. And so what we wanted to do was create a tool where managers could go and look up the fire that they're working on and get a map of recruitment probability so that they know where are they likely to see natural recovery and where are they not likely to see natural recovery where they may need to do some planting. And this is really important, increasingly important, because managers in the Forest Service, for example, or the BLM, are having increasing area burned every year, but they're still expected and required by policies to replant these areas. And so it's really difficult for them with limited resources. For example, the Forest Service, I believe, has about the same budget for reforestation that they had in the 80s, even though area burned has greatly increased since then. And so it's really challenging for these managers to try and prioritize where to spend their limited resources. And so we wanted to try and create a tool that might help with that. And so what we did was we created a tool that a manager could go in, and I should say this tool is really in the early stages of development. And also Zach Holden and his colleagues from the Region 1 Forest Service office have been doing all of the work on the front end, like the programming, creating this user interface. And I created the models that went into the predictions that this tool will give you. So basically you can go into this tool, you can click on a fire, and it will give you the probability of regeneration of ponderosa pine and Douglas-fir within that fire based on distance to seed source and also annual climate variables. And so you click on the fire, you can select the years that you want the predictions for, and then it will email you. And the outputs that it sends you are raster data sets. So first it includes fire severity, which you can get from monitoring trends in burn severity. This is an example fire that happened in 2017 outside of Missoula called the Liberty Fire. What we use this fire severity data for is also to create a distance to seed source raster. And then this raster is also supplied to the manager in case they want to see the distance to seed source. So we calculated distance to seed source just using the fire severity raster, which has 30-meter resolution. And so we assumed that any cell that burned at high severity did not have any living trees in it, that any cell burned at moderate severity still had at least some seed sources or adult trees that survived the fire. And so that's how we calculated distance to seed source. So it's basically distance to a less severe patch. We use that data and climate data then to create projections of the probability of regeneration. And as you can see, these are just examples for 4 different years from the same fire. You can see that there's variability in space. So for example, these large high severity patches that have really long distance to seed source have low recruitment probabilities. Also, this lower right-hand corner of the fire was at a lower elevation, so the recruitment probabilities there are lower than they are higher up in elevation just because it's hotter and drier. And then you also notice that there's variability over time. So for example, 1995 was a really wet year and we see high recruitment probabilities everywhere, even in this drier, lower elevation corner. And so just to really hammer home the point that recruitment probability is changing over time, this is showing the recruitment probability in this fire from 1981 to 2016. And so what you see is in the 1980s and the 1990s, there's a lot of years where there's a lot of dark blue on the maps. And so those are years that have high recruitment probability, so wetter years. And what you see over time is that we see a decline in the frequency of those wetter years. And so in the 80s, you still could have some dry years, but you were still likely within the first 5 years after fire to have at least a couple wet years, whereas that's less true in more recent decades. And so this figure also shows the importance of having some data on annual variability. So for example, if you had a fire in 2003, you might expect to get pretty good regeneration because 2004 and 2005 are relatively wet years. But if you had a fire maybe in 2005 or 2006, you maybe would get lower regeneration because the following years are pretty dry. And so this can be helpful depending on when the fire occurred to try and figure out whether or not there will be good recruitment following that fire. So of course, our tool has some limitations. And so the first one is the way that we calculated distance to seed source. Like I said, it's based on 30-meter fire severity data. And so we do assume that there's complete mortality in the high severity areas and at least some living trees in the moderate severity areas. And I have some just preliminary data that I just collected this summer from the Liberty Fire, and then some data that Kira Wolf, who's a PhD candidate in Phil Higuera's lab, collected from the Sunrise Fire, which is another fire near Missoula from 2017. And what I'm showing here is the distance to seed source on the x-axis that we measured in the field with a laser rangefinder, and then the distance to seed source that the tool predicted for that plot on the y-axis. And so the one-to-one line is the dashed line. So you can see in both cases, in the blue line is just a linear fit. And what you can see in both cases is that the tool underpredicts the distance to seed source. So we frequently found higher distance to seed sources in the field than were predicted. And also it's not a really good fit. So there's a lot of variability. So this is something that we need maybe to work on to try to figure out if there's a better way to calculate distance to seed source in the tool. And another important consideration is that we're just calculating distance to any live tree or any remaining forest following the fire, whereas the predictions are for a specific species. And so that can also be a cause of uncertainty or error, because maybe the distance to the nearest ponderosa is a lot longer than the distance to the nearest forest edge. Zach Holden has been working on trying to incorporate data that the Forest Service has about species distributions into this tool so that we can get a better estimate for different species of how long the distance to seed source is. And then also what we can't incorporate is age. So for example, in the Liberty Fire, I've been seeing a lot of stands that are younger, maybe 30 or 40 years old. So each of the trees have a few cones, but they don't have very many cones. And so those seed sources might not be as good, or they're definitely not as good seed sources as older trees that would have a lot more cones. And so that's something that we can't really decipher from satellite imagery too well. And then another important consideration is maybe distance isn't the best predictor of seed availability. So for example, various people have started using something that some people are calling propagular pressure, others are just saying percent of a surrounding radius surrounding a plot that has remaining live trees. So these pink points represent plots, the green is live trees, and the black are dead trees. And so what you see is that distance to seed source for these two plots is about the same, but we might expect to see much more regeneration in the plot on the right because it has so many live trees around it, whereas the plot on the left has fewer live trees around it. And so we're working on thinking about if there's a way that we could incorporate this type of seed availability proxy into our model. But one thing that complicates this is the planting timeline. And so in a lot of cases, the managers are trying to plant the summer following the fire. So we don't have time to wait a couple years for, like, NAEP imagery, for example, can take a couple years before it will happen again after the fire. And so there's some challenges in trying to figure out the best way to get to seed source. I'm using aerial imagery that's available following the fire, but doing it in a timeline that works for the managers. So I know there might be some Earth Lab people here or anybody else with remote sensing expertise. If you have suggestions, I'm definitely would be happy to hear of people's ideas of the best way to calculate distance to seed source from remote sensing. And then the other main limitation is that currently the tool is only for Douglas-fir and ponderosa pine, but we have, Phil and I have multiple projects funded through the North Central CASC to try to expand this to different species, including western larch. We're hoping to do the destructive sampling with actual annual resolution to add the western larch to this tool. And then we'll add other species, but with less temporal resolution. So just whether or not there's recruitment 5 or 10 years following a fire. So in that case, we won't know what year the tree's established. So we'll just have to use what was the weather like, for example, in the first 5 years following the fire, instead of knowing exactly which year the tree's established. But hopefully we'll keep expanding this tool and making it more useful. And so now I'm really excited to introduce Mike Schaedel, who is the Western Montana forester for the Nature Conservancy, who owns this lower portion of the Liberty Fire, and we've been working with him and his colleagues to try to implement this. So I'm gonna hand it over to Mike.
Great, thanks, Kim. Yeah, so it's been really exciting to work with Kim on this project, and we were able to use some of her data to help prioritize some of our planting work this spring. So the Nature Conservancy owns about 125,000 acres of former industrial timberland in western Montana right now, and we have a management staff of 2 folks. So you know, basically we own a ranger district with 2 people to manage it. So we're certainly understaffed and limited on our resources. So in 2017, the Liberty Fire burnt a portion of our landscape that the Nature Conservancy manages. It's that portion down in the blue box, the south end of the fire. The Liberty Fire is just to the east of Missoula, Montana. And it's about 32,000 acres. 8,000 acres of it was on Nature Conservancy land. And it really burnt at a mixed severity, but there were some pretty large high severity patches in the fire on TNC lands that we wanted to start thinking about regenerating. And just, you know, a little background, the Nature Conservancy is generally going to be an interim owner of a lot of this landscape. And we're looking for permanent conservation homes for the land. So often that looks like federal ownership. So we've sold some large chunks of this landscape to the Forest Service and some to the BLM. And a large portion of this part of the landscape is potentially going to be acquired by the BLM. So the BLM approached us and said, hey, would you be willing to consider doing some regeneration or some planting in some of those high severity patches? But of course, with just 2 of us working on this, we thought, well, we need to figure out where is the best place to put these trees? Where's the best bang for our buck? And so, you know, fortunately, we found Kim to start working with. So Kim, could you advance the slide here? And like I said, the landscape is it's a you know, former industrial timberland landscape. It was very heavily harvested, really from the 70s till the Nature Conservancy acquired it in 2015. So there were not a lot of large trees left on this landscape. You know, these are some pretty good representative pictures of some of the high severity burn patches. And so, you know, early on looking at this landscape and looking at some of the climate data with Kim, you know, it looked like a lot of this would regenerate naturally all right. But that distance to seed source was a pretty major consideration. You know, the trees that were on the landscape generally had a birthday of, well, they were, you know, maybe 10 to 35 years old, really at max. And then, of course, a lot of the trees that were left were not high quality seed source. So you're looking at, you know, Douglas-fir that may not have made a saw log. So not necessarily what you want regenerating your future forest. So Kim, could you advance the slide there? So yeah, so Kim used this, the tool that she's been working on to help us identify what were the patches that had a low probability of regenerating. You know, where should we put our energy into planting? And so, you know, she created a map that allowed us to go out into the field and do some really focused field reconnaissance where we could identify spots that, you know, given the climate data and some of that distance to seed source data, we were able to focus in on where we wanted to plant. And we pulled some of those large high severity patches out of consideration for this year's planting because we want to save them for next year for some of our experimental work that Kim's going to help us with. And so we were able to really hone in on some areas that we could put trees in where it was going to help increase the resilience of the forest. And you can see those hatch marked stands are the areas that we did planting this year. Of course, COVID-19 kind of threw another monkey wrench into everything. So the tree planting happened a little later in the season than we were hoping. So, you know, we'll see how the survival is, but we were able to get about 100 acres planted out there this year. And it was really a very good experience. I'm glad we had this data to help work with and focus in on where we wanted to do this work. So thanks, Kim, and everyone who did some background work on these tools. All right, and with that, Kim, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thanks, Mike. That's all we have. I just wanted to again acknowledge all my collaborators and thank the research assistants who spent a lot of long hours digging up trees in the field or staring at trees under a microscope. And then my funding sources are the Joint Fire Science Program and NSF. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. Mike said he would also be happy to answer questions, and also Phil is here as well. So if anybody has any questions.
Am I still, there we go. I'm like having problems unmuting myself. Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you also, Mike.
Oh, Heather, you muted.
Yeah, I know, it keeps happening. I'm not entirely sure what's happening. Okay. Can everyone hear me? There we go. Thank you guys so much for the presentation. It was wonderful. Thank you, Kim, and thank you, Mike. We do have a couple of questions. Some of them have already kind of been addressed in the chat box by Phil and Robin and some other folks, but I'll put them to you guys here so that we can capture it in the recording. I think the quickest, I'm gonna go in a little bit of a different order. The first question is about the Regeneration Mapper tool and if it is publicly available. And Kim, you are also muted. I think everyone has been muted.
Sorry, it is currently publicly available. As I said, it's still kind of in prototype mode. And so, yeah, I can provide a link to it, but there's a couple options on there that we're working on developing, like other species and stuff that are listed that we don't actually have the data for yet. And so, we've also had recently, for some reason, some trouble running the annual part of it. And so Zach has added an option to do 30-year climatologies, which currently is working. So it's available, but it's kind of like prototype mode. But hopefully within the next few months, we'll have it really up and running better. But I can, yeah, add a link to the chat box.
Great. And this is related, but is it possible to apply climate modeling or something so that you can see future climate projections on the tool?
That's not currently possible, but it's definitely a goal. I know Zach has been working on doing some futuring. He develops all the climate data, and so that's definitely something that we're hoping to get in there, but it's not currently available.
Okay. And there's another question about the regeneration, and I'll just read it because Tony put it so well. Could adaptive resilience be disruptive to existing ecosystems if quote unquote foreign seeds are introduced? And how common is the practice of sort of moving these seeds in, and how much research is done on the impacts?
Yeah, so this is definitely a contentious and really new developing field. I'm not an expert in it yet, but basically what I've been reading, I don't think it's widely implemented policy. Like I know for sure the Foresters isn't doing it widely. They do have experiments going on where they're looking at what happens when they do this in terms of survival and growth. There's one paper by Derek Young from California, from UC Davis, where he reported on a little bit larger scale experiments they did in California where they were planting lower elevation or seedlings from lower elevation seed sources at higher elevations on some national forest land there following fire. and they saw some support for increased survival. And then in some areas, there's really no difference between the local seed source or the lower elevation seed source. And of course, there is, as I'm sure it was what you're thinking about, the risk of losing some of that local adaptation, maybe to other things besides climate, like substrate or just other local factors. And so, yeah, I think it's something that there definitely needs to be more research on before it's really widely adapted. But I think it is something that we should consider doing in experimental form, you know, in collaboration with managers in a small scale to see, yeah, what the impacts are and what the potential is.
There was another question about if you replant trees to replace the trees that you sampled, that you took out for sampling.
No, I did not. We sampled about 30 trees per plot, and all our plots were pretty widely spaced out. So I understand the concern, but I don't think the impact was actually too great. And there were certain forests that wanted us to leave a certain density, and so we sampled like a wider transect and left like half of the seedlings there. So we tried to have it be the lowest impact possible.
Okay, back to some questions about climate variables. What were the two, I think this is just a clarifying question, the two climate variables that were most directly related to ponderosa pine recruitment?
So in the first models, it was soil moisture of the driest month and also summer vapor pressure deficit. When we moved to the coarser TerraClimate data, the soil moisture data wasn't as good. As you can imagine, like soil moisture at 4 kilometers is really a different thing than soil moisture at the plot level. And so soil moisture wasn't important in that model, which I don't think means it's not important for recruitment. It was just the scale of the data. But summer vapor pressure deficit was still really important, as well as maximum temperature of the hottest month.
Okay, and this one is a question about ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation. Is there a strong enough relationship between ENSO and precipitation in Western Montana that it could help forecast or kind of preview whether an upcoming planting season might be more or less likely to be successful?
Maybe Phil wants to answer this one because I know he thinks a lot about large-scale climatology.
Sorry, Kim, I was typing in. I think about ENSO for fire. This question was is on regen, right?
Yeah.
Well, I'll answer with respect to fire, and then Kim, that you guys have a recent paper in that's speaking
Yeah.
a little bit, right? I'll just say big picture in fire in terms of predicting regional fire years, and the value of ENSO degrades somewhere in central or northern Colorado, at least in the tree ring record, and in records of fire activity over the last 30 to 40 years, or actually I'd say 30 to 100 years. It doesn't mean that ENSO, it doesn't necessarily mean that ENSO has no impact, but there are other atmospheric conditions that seem to be more directly correlated, with PDO being one of them. But of course that varies at longer time scales, so it lacks the annual, or it lacks the value for prediction at an individual fire season scale.
Yeah, so I was going to say about a similar thing. So I've been working with another postdoc of Solomon Dabrowski, who was working with John Abatsoglu as well, who's a climatologist. And so they've identified a climate dipole, so between the Southwest and the Northern Rockies, where we do see like opposite conditions emerge in certain years. And it's somewhat linked to ENSO, but like Phil said, it's also linked to all these other climate drivers like the PDO. So it's not really to the point where ENSO is the main driver of it. And so it's hard to predict just from ENSO whether or not it's going to be a good year for recruitment.
Okay, and then here's another question. I think this is related to the tool, but are you able to identify alternative trees whose recruitment polygon might match the current or the future conditions as options for managers?
No, yeah, is the answer for that right now. But there are tools out there, like the seed lot selection tool, for example, which has been developed, I think, by Oregon State, and that's a tool that has like the future projections of climate in certain areas and can try to help match like where on the landscape currently are the conditions that there will be in the futures that you could go collect seed from those areas. So that's a tool that try and help select seeds that might match the future conditions of your site.
Okay. And then I think this might actually be the last one in the chat box, and then we'll open it up for folks for the last couple minutes. But did any of your research occur within, I'm not really sure what AF or ES habitat types means.
I
Phil,
think
can you answer
Engelmann
that?
spruce, subalpine fir. Is that what you mean, Gary? Higher elevations. I believe that's what he means.
That's what I would guess.
Okay, great. So in those habitat types, thank you for clarifying that, guys. Obviously not a forester here, that most occur within higher elevations.
So no, we haven't done anything in those habitat types yet, but we have a project with the North Central CASC where we're hoping to use some existing data that others have collected, like Brian Harvey and Dan Donato, following fires in these higher elevation areas, to link that recruitment or not to the weather conditions following fire. So for example, Brian Harvey and his sites did see that the weather in the first 3 years following a fire was related to, I think, both subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce recruitment. But we're hoping to use some of that data to be able to incorporate those species into this tool framework.
Okay, and of course there is one more that popped up. How important is local shading? How important is that as a factor for the tree regeneration?
Yeah, that's definitely, well, I'll let Mike answer this too, because he is out in the field a lot. But we've done some work in our lab looking at microclimate and the effect of canopy cover on microclimate, or the effect of fire severity on microclimate. And it's hugely important. Like, we see big differences in temperature, like on average 2 to 5 degrees Celsius between areas with canopy cover or without canopy cover. And also big differences in vapor pressure deficit. So having some canopy cover theoretically should help survival, but I guess there's probably trade-offs with ponderosa liking sun. So maybe Mike can also speak to this.
I mean, certainly from a seedling survival, having something to ameliorate the climatic condition helps. You know, having a microsite, having some shading from either a log or a stump or a standing snag. I mean, it's pretty standard practice when planting to use microsites, and in fact, all the planting we did out, on the Liberty Fire involved microsite only planting. So I think it's certainly true that that's important.
Okay, so that's all the questions that are in the chat. We still have a couple minutes left, so we will open it up if anybody wants to ask a question directly to our folks. I think you should be able to unmute yourselves, if not immediately, in a moment or two.
I'll chime in.
I'm going to share Kim's paper on microclimate and forest regeneration here in the chat.
Great, thanks, Phil. This is Imtiaz. Just start asking from my side. Looks like your model is sensitive to climate metrics like temperature, your maximum summertime temperature, and BPD. just wondering how, what kind of confidence you have that in the real world, those sensitivities are quite genuine, because, you know, we do know that these metrics, especially under future climate change, do go up much more aggressively than things like soil moisture and such, that are more land-based moisture quantities than the atmospheric dryness quantities and like the heat quantities.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, especially for ponderosa pine, which was the future predictions were with just temperature and vapor pressure deficit, that might over-predict the recruitment limitations that we would expect in the future. It's really hard. I mean, if you know a good source of soil moisture data with features, that I would be really interested in hearing about that, because yeah, that's a limitation that we had, although the Douglas-fir model did have deficit, which is still an atmospheric measure. But I think that maybe tempered some of the changes that we've seen in Doug-fir, maybe between the 80s and the 2000s.
Thanks.
And we might have time for one more if somebody has one more question.
I just want to give a quick plug for Kim. Not only is she a great researcher, she actually came out in the field with us and planted trees for a day. So she knows how to swing a hodad and actually put some trees in the ground. So thanks, Kim, for building some resilience out there in the landscape.
Yeah, well, also likewise, Mike is a great collaborator, and his coworker Steve, it was been really great to go out in the field with them. So really appreciate working with them as well.
Wonderful. Well, Kim and Mike and Phil, thank you so much for being our inaugural presenters for our webinar series. So again, thank you very much. Well, our next webinar will be in September, and there'll be another one in December. And so look for more information from us at the NC CASC about the upcoming topics and the ways to register for those. So with that, I think I will call it good, unless Kim or Mike or Phil, do you have anything that you'd like to say?
And yeah, thanks for the invitation.
All right. Well, thank you all. Have a great day, everyone.
So.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks again, Mike.